Okay, so tonight it's great to be here with Jody and Dee and sharing Deadly ABCD. And before we move on, sharing this artwork with you, I just want to acknowledge Josh Wanganeen from Dungala Dreaming, who created this amazing digital art for us, and he does amazing artwork. And I actually work alongside Josh when I do work down at VACSEL, which is the Victorian Aboriginal Community Service Association Limited, that do a lot of work with community, as well as having one of the two Victorian Aboriginal owned and operated registered training organisations here in Victoria. So the Deadly ABCD team, as you can see there, is myself, Jody and Dee, and we've been on an interesting 5-year journey of discovery, and it came through conversations that Jody and I started having, and then started having some yarns with Dee around, what would it look like if we brought Aboriginal culture into asset-based community development, and what does that look like as an alternative to some other community development programs that exist within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So, and that was sort of the birthing about 5 years ago of Deadly ABCD. And we've sort of moved it along. There's been a bit of stalling and starting, but we're sort of on track now. And we did sort of a first soft launch at Barangaroo in Sydney last year with a group of community members and elders, where we shared what we've been doing and got some feedback from them to actually help us really deepen what Deadly ABCD is. So when we think about Deadly ABCD and creating strong and deadly communities through yarning and these really participatory methods that we use generally in ABCD, but actually putting it in a model where we tap into cultural learning techniques and narratives. So thinking about community always being at the centre of what we do, and then honouring things that already happen in Aboriginal communities around, being place-based, the importance of country and what that means. Tapping into the wisdom of local leadership, focusing on actually what communities have, rather than, starting that conversation around what communities need. It's actually looking at the strengths of the communities and building on them. But really important, it's about creating those culturally safe spaces where we can be in learning together to build relationships. So what we're looking at this evening is that sort of outer ring where we're looking at, what does a community owned and led, what are the stories, the history, Aboriginal law and culture. And the reason we talk about this when we think about how we engage and interact with Aboriginal communities is that we need to have some sort of understanding. We need to understand where community has been so that we can actually develop empathy and actually be able to identify some of those really rich assets, and a bit, thinking about the check-in question, it's that tapestry of community. So what we're going to look at tonight is some of that, the stories and history that have sort of helped shape Deadly ABCD and help shape how we move forward. So before we engage with communities, we need to have this knowledge. It's not just walking in and being the expert, because Aboriginal communities are the experts. They know, and they've got that deep-seated sense of culture and law and being really mindful that anything we do must be community owned and led. If you're a white fella walking into a black fella community, they're the experts, not you. So that using some of these principles of Deadly ABC to actually guide us when we work with Aboriginal communities. So having a look a little bit about the history. So this is that, sharing the stories of what's happened, and we'll just touch a little bit on each of the sort of eras that we've gone through in Australia over the last 230 odd years. So obviously there was that pre-first contact, where at that point in time there was over 250 language groups, which you can see on the map there, over 400 clans or cultural groups, Aboriginal mob, and it was estimated between 300,000 to 1 million people were here at first contact. Then, of course, we had Captain Cook in 1770, which was followed on by the period of invasion when the First Fleet and Captain Arthur Phillip arrived, and British law became law of the land and basically dispossessed Aboriginal people of everything that they knew and held dear. And in essence, they became stateless with no legal standing in this new world that they found themselves in. Just wanting to touch a little bit here, we slave trade in those early years and in building of Australia was very common. Aboriginal people were rounded up and were working on building up all of those industries you can see there to create the Australia as we know it now. So then we had the 1700s to the 1820s, which was sort of that invasion, but leading into the settlement period, where basically white settlers took over the land, brought with them all sorts of diseases, but at the same time, Aboriginal people were really fighting for retention of their land, but unfortunately were murdered in mass numbers, and it was really the start of the genocide of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And as we can see here from the map, this gives you a bit of an idea of some of the massacre sites around the country. And I think from memory, and this information comes from the University of Newcastle, who have done quite a bit of mapping around this, and each of these sites, a massacre meant more than 6 people from memory. So gives you a bit of an idea. And then we moved into the protection and segregation era, where the Aborigines Protection Act was introduced. Children were starting to be forcibly removed from communities, and of course, Aboriginal people had no voting rights. And just a little bit of history here. When we have the conversation that happens and occurs much more now, the narrative around Australia Day, and people saying it's only something new, Aboriginal people marching or communities out there marching or celebrating, not celebrating, but commemorating Australia Day. It actually started back in 1938 with the first protest and declaration of a day of mourning. So it's not something new. It's not something that was only sort of dreamt up in recent years. So then we moved through into the 50s and 60s of the assimilation era, where there were rules for black and white. It was very much segregation. Aboriginal people were part Aboriginal, and back then they used horrible terms like half caste, quarter caste, etc. They were assimilated into white society. Then moving into the 60s, where we had the integration era, where Aboriginal people finally got the right to vote in 1962. And then there was a whole lot of activism happening with Charles Perkins, the Freedom Rides, and we had also had the Wave Hill walkout, which started to get the conversation around equal wages for Aboriginal people. So you can see here, and some of these are photos from Jodie's hometown, which I'm now going to pass over to Jode for him to pick up from this integration era. Over to you, Jodie.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, look, it was still a very turbulent time, especially in my hometown at Moree, where, there was a colour bar on a lot of the public places, and people still needed permission to move about, even in town, to frequent cafes, and, there was still a lot of segregation still, even at, during these years. In terms of the Freedom Rides, Charles Perkins led a group of university students on a bus trip around the northwest part of New South Wales, and that was all about breaking down those barriers and pretty much demonstrating against a lot of the racial tension that existed in a lot of these country towns. And then we move into the 72 to 2000, which is the self-determination and self-management era, where the Aborigines Protection Act was abolished by the government. Our people were given a voice to government, with ATSIC being formed, and following on from the Mabo High Court decision, native title is finally recognised in the highest court of the land. In the next era, we then move into where we are now, which is pretty much around the reconciliation era. And during this time, the United Nations Committee on Eliminating Racial Discrimination criticised the Australian government for their response to the Bring Them Home report, which is all about the stolen generation. Kathy Freeman won gold for Australia in the 400 metres, and the federal government amends the Racial Discrimination Act before bringing in the Northern Territory intervention, which is very, it was a very hot debate, very much a hot debate, the intervention. So continuing on, Reconciliation Australia was born in January 2001. It was a 50-year commemoration of Maralinga, where a lot of the atomic bombs were being tested by the British government, and the national apology given by Kevin Rudd acknowledged the stolen generation, which was very heartfelt, and it only seemed like yesterday. Moving on, we had a surge of our people entering into politics in most states, and notably Tony Abbott became Prime Minister during these times, where he declared that he was also the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. And as you can see through a lot of these policies and timelines, that there was some political science at play, to oppress our people. During this era as well, leading up to where we are now, there's a lot of impact of colonisation that's still evident in communities. A lot of unresolved trauma, especially around, equal access and equal rights, sovereignty, sovereign rights over our own country. And where we're up to as well is the Uluru Statement from the Heart was also delivered to government back in 2017, which pretty much is a conversation piece to start discussions with amending Australia's constitution to include our people. So the impact, in summarising now, we've got economic and social disadvantage, high levels of incarceration, which is where the Black Lives Matter movement picks up on our Black Deaths in Custody, physical and mental abuse, And as I said earlier, unresolved trauma and disconnection from our culture, including language, dance, art, and all of the cultural ways of life. So what is Deadly ABCD? You may ask. Deadly ABCD is asset-based community development. It's about Jeddah Institute deeply listening into to community to identify their story, which uncovers their strengths, gifts, talents and resources. So both on an individual level and also on a community level. What ABCD or Deadly ABCD is about as well is discovering the strengths, which is a powerful and productive way for communities to address local concerns. And it's about uncovering the opportunities and coming together to realise a shared vision. So that's what Deadly ABCD is about.